Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. In the choking depths of the Segmentum Tempestus, there was once a world so dense with humanity, it seemed to hum with thought. Heliosa, a hive world of impossible verticality, where spires rose like titanic needles into a blackened sky, and the lower levels never knew the sun. It had always been loyal, a loyal dog, some would say, wagging its tail at Imperial tithe demands, offering its sons to the guard, its daughters to the schola, its psychers to the black ships. But loyalty has a breaking point, and on Heliosa it came not with chaos or Xeno's corruption, but with an idea. A whisper, rising from the underhive and spreading like a virus up through the hives. What if Terra had already fallen in all but name? What if humanity's true soul was here, among the smoke and suffering, waiting to be reborn? The Heliosa Uprising didn't begin with guns, it began with dreams, shared visions, eerie sermons, and the quiet devotion of the hopeless. It was a heresy without daemons, a rebellion without traitors. Or so they claimed. When the Hive world declared itself the second Terra, it shocked not only the Imperium but even the Inquisition, for it did not renounce the Emperor, it claimed to embody him anew. What followed was a horror drama of ecclesiastical panic, psychic implosions, and the bitter poetry of a civilization desperate to believe that the future could be written not in blood, but in revelation. And yet, blood was always the ink of mankind. It began in whispers through the shrine warrens and maintenance cloisters, in the forgotten places where faith and grime shared the same breath. The cult of Terra incarnate was never officially sanctioned, never mentioned in sermons by the ecclesiarchy. It emerged like a thorned vine, weaving through the spiritual rot of Heliosa. Its tenets were simple but dangerous. Terra was no longer the cradle of humanity's soul. Its skies were polluted by bureaucracy, its people hollowed by millennia of dogma. Heliosa, in contrast, was living. Its struggle, its agony, its sheer pressure, these, they said, made it more divine than the fossilized emperor's throne ever could. Terra had become a tomb, Heliosa a womb. At first, the cult was thought little more than a mutation of local devotion. Heliosa had always possessed a fervent religious undercurrent, as most hive worlds do, born from suffering and the need to make sense of unrelenting hardship. But the cult of Terra incarnate was different. It did not ask for prayers, it gave them. Not to saints, but to the idea of a second Terra, a place reborn from human truth rather than sacred tradition. Their texts, etched onto scavenged plastic and whispered in hydraulic tongues, claimed that the Emperor's light could pass through flesh, not yet ossified by hierarchy. That humanity could begin again, not from orbit, but from soil touched by ash and tears. The ecclesiarchy failed to recognize the threat, in part because it was not blasphemous in the usual sense. The cult did not deny the Emperor, it embraced him more intimately, portraying him not as a distant god, but as a presence yearning to be reborn through human struggle. This theological subtlety allowed the cult to evade early detection. It even absorbed existing minor sects, offering them something more compelling than the stale incense of sanctioned faith. By the time the Ministorum became aware, the cult of Terra incarnate had representatives in dozens of Habspires, labor consortia, and even low-tier administratum branches. Their art was terrifyingly beautiful. Murals of a rising Heliosa formed from golden trash and human blood, haloed spire children reaching toward a black sun. A new iconography took shape, a broken aquila, wings molten into chains of light. They celebrated suffering not as penance, but as proof. The soul is forged in smoke, one of their most repeated litanies said, and Heliosa is the kiln. It was this inversion of imperial doctrine, not rejection, but reinterpretation, that made the cult so dangerous. It whispered to the broken, the disillusioned, the forgotten. And in the hives of Heliosa, such souls were as common as rust. The turning point came when high ecclesiarchal envoys attempted to publicly denounce the movement. They were not met with violence, but with silence, an eerie, unified silence from thousands gathered at the basilica of the searing god. The envoys left unnerved, but the cult had already interpreted the moment as prophetic. Silence is the voice of truth, they inscribed on every surface they could reach. Soon after, the first of the living saints of Heliosa appeared. Mortals so infused with conviction they could walk through fire, survive gunshots, or inspire riots with a glance. Whether these abilities were real or psychically fueled by collective belief, None could say, but the effects were undeniable. It was not long before the cult began to rewrite history. Through stolen data slates and encrypted pict feeds, they disseminated a new narrative. Terra had been the emperor's cradle, but Heliosa was his cocoon. Terra had given birth to a golden age that had decayed into iron chains. Heliosa, brutal and raw, was where the emperor's will now gestated, away from the corruption of power. This narrative began to mutate into faith, and faith into law. Cells of the cult began refusing to follow local governors' commands, citing Terra incarnate protocols as their new scripture. And when asked by the Arbites to clarify their intentions, cult leaders responded with chill and calm. "We do not rise in rebellion, we rise in rebirth." By this stage, the Inquisition had started to take notice, but their early reports were divided. Some saw the cult as a heretical echo of the Horus heresy, a potential psychic catastrophe in the making. Others viewed it as a localized theological aberration, disturbing, yes, but containable. Both groups underestimated how deeply the cult of Terra incarnate had rooted itself into the social and spiritual bedrock of Heliosa. It was no longer a faith. It was an identity, a promise, and in a galaxy where hope is a weapon rarer than a Titan's cannon, the cult had found a way to mass-produce it. When the first banners were unfurled across the Hive spires, fabric dyed with the blood of oath-bound martyrs bearing the words, "We are Terra now," it was no longer a question of faith, but of sovereignty. A Hive world had not simply gone rogue. It had declared that the galaxy's holy center was no longer where the Emperor sat, entombed in silence, but where billions still screamed and believed. They called him the last governor, but his real name, Zarek Halvan, was etched only briefly in Heliosa's records before being drowned in blood and myth. Halvan was a functionary of the Imperium, installed by a distant High Lord who had never even pronounced Heliosa correctly. He was a typical planetary governor, bloated with favors, surrounded by sycophants, and armored in layers of denial. When the cult of Terra incarnate began whispering of rebirth and sovereignty, Halvan responded with indifference. When they took over 2 administratum precincts, he issued a memo. When the Arbites warned him of rising sympathies among the Hive enforcers, he replaced them with imported mercenaries from a nearby mining world. It was not until a crowd of 10,000 chanted, "Long live the true Terra" beneath his spire that he finally reacted, and by then, it was far too late. The assassination of Zarek Halvan was the cult's first true martyr-making moment, though he was not the one they mourned. He died in silence, his body found hanging upside down from a broken transport crane, his eyes burned out with promethium, a symbolic act, they said, for the blindness of Terra's faithful. His palace was not looted, but transformed into a sanctum of remembrance for the unnamed. Mosaics of workers, children, and faded servitors lined its halls. The cult did not celebrate the killing. They treated it as a grim inevitability, a symptom of spiritual autophagy when a decaying system consumes itself. But even as Halvan fell, others rose. The noble houses of Heliosa, many of whom had profited from centuries of tithe manipulation and serf exploitation, saw the cult's rise with alarm. House Ventari, known for its psychic breeding programs, attempted to align itself with the cult early, offering sacred marriages between its scions and prominent cult leaders. The cult refused. Heliosa's rebirth would not be gilded in the old blood. That refusal triggered a cascade of panic among the elite. House Dargellan activated its private armies and began a ruthless purge of suspected cultists, executing hundreds in a single night and broadcasting the massacres as warnings. Instead, the cult used the footage in reverse, looping the images as martyr tapes, turning tragedy into fuel. Not all nobility opposed the movement. Lady Varel Oren of House Trist, once in exile for sedition, returned to Heliosa amid the chaos, draped in rust-colored robes and wearing the sigil of the broken Aquila. She claimed no title but walked unchallenged into the most sacred cult shrines. Her sermons, laced with sorrow and resolve, spoke of the failure of lineage and the death of prestige. "The Emperor," she once said before a congregation of Underhive children, "does not sit upon gold, he is crucified upon our silence." Her voice, broadcast through the Hive Vox Spiralis, became a unifying force, and when she was shot through the heart by a sniper, the cult did not mourn, they rose. Oren became their first official martyr, and within days, entire sectors of the Hive declared independence, not in violence, but in song. The uprising took a strange form in its early days. Rather than outright war, there were renunciations. Governing councils refused to report to the planetary capital. Factoria guilds stopped counting labor quotas and began assigning tasks based on reverence value, the perceived spiritual worth of one's work. The Hive's transport spines lit up not with military alerts, but with litanies. It was revolution by reinterpretation. Enforcers who joined the cult began calling themselves witnesses, patrolling not to enforce order, but to narrate change. Public executions were replaced with public confessions, in which repentant nobles recited their crimes before being cast into the glow pits to be spiritually remade or consumed. It was unclear which was more true. Amid this spiritual political metamorphosis, the Adeptus Arbites attempted to reassert control. Their courthouse bastion in Hive Orotos became a fortress besieged not by armies, but by belief. Cultists lined the perimeter, chanting for weeks without food, until the Arbites' garrison cracked, not from battle, but from hallucinations and desertion. One final Vox recording from within the bastion simply repeated, "They are not wrong. We were taught to kill doubt, not question it." By this time, even the administratum clerks, those gray-hooded tithe counters and logistics slaves, began to defect. They brought with them secrets, forgotten food reserves, hidden vaults, transportation codes. The uprising turned these tools not into weapons, but into statements. 1,000,000 barrels of grain meant for off-world tithe were redistributed in a single night, with every sack stamped, "We do not deny Terra, we fulfill it." The Imperium, of course, did not watch idly. But Heliosa's early defiance was so spiritual, so subversively passive, that standard response protocols could not be cleanly applied. Was it heresy, rebellion, or a psychological contagion? Segmentum Command floundered, sending conflicting orders to planetary defense forces, while nearby fleet detachments awaited clarification. Every delay gave the movement more time. By the time a consensus was reached, Heliosa had declared itself not in fire or fury, but in identity. And that was something far more difficult to extinguish. They came from every strata of Heliosa's towering Hive cities, each bearing a piece of the same fractured vision. In the upper spires, where oxygen was filtered thrice and walls gleamed with imported marble, nobles awoke from dreams soaked in sweat, their tongues speaking forgotten dialects. In the sump depths, amid corpse starch refineries and radiation blooms, scavenger children saw burning spires reflected in toxic pools and whispered to one another, "It is here." The dream of a second Terra did not spread through instruction, it was inhaled like a shared breath. It rose from lungs scarred by industry and sank into souls corroded by centuries of neglect. The miracle and the terror was that the dream was the same, whether it emerged from luxury or squalor. The upper Hivers were the first to organize their experience into scripture. They called themselves the Architects of Dawn, a collective of former nobles, ex-administratum scholars, and rogue psychers who believed Heliosa was resonating with a psychic pulse, not from the warp, but from the collective unconscious of mankind. They built shrines not from gold, but from memory. Vast mural sculptures of Terra as it once was, reimagined in Heliosa's broken symmetry. Their art wasn't nostalgic, it was revisionist. They didn't want to return to Terra, they wanted to overwrite it. In the Underhives, the vision took on a different shape. It was raw, violent, tangled in survival. Gangs that once killed over water filters now offered each other sanctuary in exchange for sacred tales. These were not scriptures, they were confessions. "I saw the Emperor," a one-eyed scummer once said, "but he wore my father's face and told me to keep digging." The dream wasn't about power, it was about meaning. These were people who had never believed they mattered. Now, the universe itself whispered otherwise. What is haunting about Heliosa's uprising is not its structure, but its synchronicity. Entire sectors began acting as if a script had been written into their blood. Without coordination, they enacted symbolic rituals at the same time. 1,000 Hivers in different spires cast off their identity tags and inscribed the words, "I am Terra," into their skin. In 3 unrelated Hive domes, manufactorum workers stopped all machinery for precisely 22 minutes at midday, then resumed work without explanation. When later interviewed by the Ordo Hereticus, survivors claimed, It just felt right. No leader had given orders. No messages had been exchanged. It was a tide moving beneath the surface, invisible but unstoppable. The old Imperial structures crumbled not from attack, but from spiritual disuse. The Arbites' courthouses were emptied, their armories raided, not for weapons, but for data on noble bloodlines and tithing injustices. Sanctioned psychers found themselves unable to channel the warp, their powers blocked, not by external forces, but by internal crises of belief. The Emperor's Tarot, long used for guidance, began to produce the same spread on every reading across the planet: the Falling Tower, the Blind Pilgrim, and the Second Sun. Interrogators recorded over 200 identical instances before finally ceasing documentation, some breaking their quills in existential panic. Heliosa's voice echoed even in the data slums, those digital vaults of decaying memory and corrupted cogitator logic. Machine spirits began spitting out corrupted litanies, binaric prayers that referenced new throne and ash-crowned majesty. The tech priests of Mars blamed viral logic, but no known scrap code matched the patterns. The Mechanicus tried to purge the heresy through sanctified firewalls, but even the red-robed magi could not explain why the voice returned, calmer, more complete, every time it was erased. Perhaps the most disturbing element of the vision's spread was its absolute rejection of coercion. People joined not out of fear, nor under pressure, but from an interior certainty. Heliosa's dream was not a command, it was a revelation. Once seen, it could not be unseen. This made the cult impossible to root out through conventional means. There were no cells to infiltrate, no leaders to interrogate. There were only believers, each one believing the same thing differently. Children became its fiercest prophets. In the glow-lit corridors of education, Habs and labor orphanariums, they would speak with eerie calm about the coming dawn. One famously blind child, called Luma, spoke aloud coordinates to a forgotten observatory, sealed for centuries. When brought there, inquisitorial agents discovered a cache of ancient astropathic recordings, Terra's original broadcasts, distorted but intact. The tapes were never made public. Some say they heard a voice weeping. The most chilling manifestation of this collective fervor came during what became known as the concordance of breath. On the 13th day of the uprising, every recorded human on Heliosa, billions, simultaneously exhaled. Sensors confirmed a measurable drop in atmospheric pressure. No one knows why. No one can explain how. But on that day, Heliosa felt alive. Not metaphorically, but physically. The world sighed, and the Imperium shuddered. It was not a rebellion fueled by anger. It was a movement shaped by grief, by longing, by the unbearable weight of forgotten lives daring to dream again. This was not sedition. It was communion. And that, more than any bolter or demon, was what made Heliosa so utterly dangerous. It was not merely a declaration. It was a detonation, psychic, spiritual, and political. On the 15th day of the uprising, Heliosa's central Vox Tower, the Spire of Saints Unnamed, activated an ancient broadcast array that had been dormant since the age of apostasy. Across thousands of systems in the Segmentum Tempestus, and leaking beyond into fringe roots of Obscurus and Solar, a single message echoed through astropathic channels, rogue trader relays, and even black ship ciphers. It was not encrypted. It was not hidden. It was simply undeniable. This is Heliosa. We are Terra. We are the second light. The message repeated exactly 13 times, then fell silent. The Imperium, in all its creaking inertia, froze. Segmentum Command in Hydrafor locked down all inbound and outbound communications. The astropathic choir of Reth seized in synchrony, bleeding from the eyes as they choked out the same words in unison. We are the breath made stone. We are the new throne. Ships lost their navigational anchors as astropaths collapsed under a psychic feedback they could not trace. Not warp interference, but something far stranger. Human hope weaponized, belief turned into signal. The 13th Declaration, as it came to be known, was the moment Heliosa ceased being a rogue world and became a metaphysical rebellion. The content of the broadcast was not long, nor overtly hostile. It made no threats. It demanded no capitulations. But the very act of declaring oneself as the spiritual center of humanity, not as a usurper, but as a successor, was a heresy deeper than any spoken by traitor legions or alien prophets. Each repetition of the message altered slightly in tone, as if voiced by different speakers, young, old, wounded, exalted. On the 9th transmission, a child's voice whispered, "The Emperor dreams beneath our feet." On the 12th, an old man gasped, "You left us in darkness. We forged a sun." Vox analysis later confirmed the tonal harmonics resonated with frequencies known to agitate pariahs. Even blanks reportedly wept when exposed to the raw recording. The reactions were swift and chaotic. The ecclesiarchy issued an emergency synod known as the Flame Convocation. 12 cardinals called for immediate exterminatus. 8 refused, citing spiritual ambiguity. 2 self-immolated during the debate. The Ordo Hereticus issued contradictory orders. Some inquisitors were instructed to isolate Heliosa, others to study it. None were told to ignore it. One dispatch noted ominously, "Do not treat this as a rebellion. Treat this as a mutation of destiny." On Heliosa itself, the broadcast was followed by silence. No celebrations, no proclamations, only the slow raising of banners across the Hive cities. "We have spoken." The cult did not see the act as defiance, but as fulfillment. Their doctrine had evolved. They now preached that Terra had been the first breath, the exhalation of human divinity, and that Heliosa was the inhalation, drawing that scattered glory into focus once more. The message was never meant to convert. It was meant to reveal. For loyalist forces stationed within Heliosa's planetary guard, the message was shattering. A full 20% of command staff resigned their commissions within 3 days, declaring fealty not to the rebels, but to the truth beneath the lie. General Kars Albrecht, a decorated commander with 30 years of Imperial service, transmitted a brief farewell before walking into a Hive furnace. His final words, "We forgot how to believe." The administratum panicked. Emergency Scrivener squads were dispatched to redact the broadcast from system records. But they failed spectacularly. The message was self-replicating. Any attempt to delete it resulted in the formation of new subfilaments in data stacks, twisting into the words, "witness." Tech priests believed they were dealing with an information construct, a mimetic virus, but those attempts to isolate it ended with their cogitators inscribing strange symmetries onto themselves, forming recursive circuits resembling the Heliosan icon, the spiral sun. Perhaps the most surreal response came from fringe Imperial cults and isolated worlds. On the shrine world of Valtoris, a sect known as the Crimson Sisters ritually blinded themselves and carved Heliosa's coordinates into their flesh. On the mining world of Raxan Primaris, servitor miners sang hymns matching Heliosa's tone, though they had no Vox access. A rogue trader passing through the Halo stars claimed to encounter a Xenos species singing the name of Terra, but not yours. Somehow the declaration had leapt across not just distance, but understanding. And still, Heliosa remained quiet. Its Hive cities glowed with internal peace, their people not celebratory but solemn. The cult's response to inquiries was always the same. We said what we were. The stars must now choose whether to listen. The Imperium, bloated and fragmented, had no coordinated response. Its usual answer, violence, was slow in coming. Segmentum commanders debated naval mobilization. The Inquisition wavered between quarantine and annihilation. The ecclesiarchy was locked in internal purges, weeding out those who sympathized even a fraction with the message. Across the stars, silence reigned. Not because there was nothing to say, but because Heliosa had already said everything. They would never admit fear, not publicly. Not within the vaulted halls of the ecclesiarchy, where the scent of sanctified oils mixed with incense and the perpetual drone of devotion filled every corridor. But behind closed doors, when the stained glass filtered too much light onto trembling hands, the Adeptus Ministorum trembled. Not because a world had declared heresy, that was almost routine, but because Heliosa had dared to redefine faith without invoking chaos, Xenos corruption, or madness. It had challenged the ecclesiarchy not with fire, but with meaning. The priests of Terra were not unaccustomed to schisms. There had been divergent cults, rogue preachers, even entire shrine worlds that went apostate before. But Heliosa's declaration struck at the very root of their power. It claimed continuity, not rejection. The cult of Terra incarnate didn't deny the Emperor. They simply said he lived anew, within the suffering and belief of Heliosa. And if that were true, then the ecclesiarchy was not a vessel of the divine, but its fossil. Reports streamed in from confessor networks and preacher vox chains. Pilgrims began rerouting to Heliosa instead of Terra. Local shrines removed golden aquillas and replaced them with spiral sun emblems. In some sectors, priests were found sobbing at their altars, uncertain whether they served a lie. The ecclesiarchy tried to counter this with an outpouring of pageantry, mass sermons, miracle reenactments, beatifications of long-dead saints. But these efforts fell flat, like trying to shout down a memory. Heliosa had already embedded itself in the collective faith of millions, not through conquest, but by resonance. The most damning blow came from within. Some of the ecclesiarchy's own servants began to falter. Missionaries and confessors stationed on fringe worlds began echoing Heliosan doctrines. One famous case involved preacher militant Harvin Vox, a firebrand whose sermons had converted entire planetary populations. After hearing a fragment of the 13th declaration, Vox publicly renounced his title, shaved his scalp, and broadcast a single message: "We taught faith through fear. Heliosa teaches it through reflection. Choose." He was declared extremis diabolus within hours, but the damage was irreversible. His words echoed louder than any litany. The ecclesiarchy's attempts to smear Heliosa bordered on the pathetic. They claimed sorcery, then were shown testimonies from blanks who felt no corruption. They claimed warp taint, only to discover sanctioned psychers could not detect any aberration. They accused Xenos infiltration, but their own Ordo Xenos allies found no trace. One cardinal proposed the world be declared null terra, a spiritual dead zone to be avoided entirely. But others argued this would legitimize Heliosa further, like exiling a prophet and then watching their legend bloom. In desperation, they turned to symbolic acts. On the hallowed steps of the Basilica Magnifica, a chained procession of penitents were forced to crawl and proclaim Terra's supremacy while being scourged. It was streamed across the segmentum in grotesque spectacle. The reaction was disastrous. Heliosa responded not with condemnation, but with a haunting silence. And when the next Heliosan sermon was shared, voiced by a street child and aired across Pirate Vox, it said simply, "We do not punish belief, we nurture it." That was the final fracture for many fringe clergy. The ecclesiarchy was a machine of devotion, yes, but it was also a machine of fear. And now, for the first time in generations, it found itself trying to compete with a vision of the emperor that was gentler, more human, and terrifyingly more believable. It was not that Heliosa's vision lacked fervor. Far from it. Their rituals were intense, their convictions profound. But they were not imposed from above, they arose from below. The spiral sun did not demand blood, it demanded memory, it demanded reflection. In the ecclesiarchy's eyes, this was not only heresy, it was worse. It was relevance without authorization. The ultimate irony was that Heliosa had resurrected the very thing the Ministorum feared most: authentic belief. Not regimented, not trained, not bureaucratized, just felt. For an organization built on codified dogma and political power, that kind of raw, untamed faith was as corrosive as acid. No wonder they panicked. No wonder their sermons grew shrill. They were not fighting a rival religion. They were fighting the rebirth of religion itself. When the Ministorum's High Synod finally declared Heliosa anathema, there were no trumpets, no hymns, just a quietly distributed decree, black-sealed and blood-marked. All who echo the spiral lie shall be purged, no confession accepted, no absolution possible. And yet, even as this message spread, reports arrived of more worlds adopting Heliosa's teachings, not in open revolt, but in subtle devotion. Chapels began rebranding themselves as refuges of the breath. Old sermons were revised to include phrases like Terra reborn and light from below. The Adeptus Ministorum had always believed it was the sole arbiter of the emperor's voice. Heliosa whispered otherwise, and across the stars, billions listened. They came not with parades or declarations, but as silent shapes descending through the ash-draped atmosphere of Heliosa. Black ships, ancient and unreadable, their hulls etched with runes that flickered in the sight of the soul. To the average citizen, their arrival was a myth confirmed. For millennia, these vessels had taken Heliosa's psychers, children and adults, frightened or willing, never to be seen again. Now they returned, not as servants of the Imperium's tithe, but as omens. Something had changed, and the Adeptus Astra Telepathica had come not to collect, but to contain. The first signs were subtle. Astropathic choirs throughout the Hive began to falter, their harmony collapsing into static-laced babble. Dreams became not just vivid, but communal. Entire hab blocks would wake with the same memories, speaking in tongues they never learned. Vox systems began to bleed low whispers at odd hours, speaking names that no one should know. The spiral sun, it seemed, had found its voice in the warp, not as corruption, but as pressure. A tide pulling at every latent psyker on the world, calling them home. The telepathica agents did not descend openly. They moved through Hive depths in robes of shadow, escorted by mind-blind servitors and void-shielded escort teams. Their orders were unrecorded, sealed beneath layers of ciphered authority. What they enacted was not a tithe, but a purge. Thousands of psykers were taken in a matter of days, young seers, shrine chanters, low-level telepaths. They disappeared, not into training, but into silence. None returned. Their families received nothing. Even their names were erased from local archives. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the psykers were being rendered into null ciphers, souls emptied to suppress the spiral signal. Others believed they were being bound into astropathic dampeners, their minds fused into anti-prophetic engines. One tale spoke of a child named Oriel who levitated during a community sermon and wept golden tears before being seized by a faceless agent. That story ended with an entire spire block being disconnected from central power, its population left to starve in the dark. What terrified the people most was the nature of the psychic storm. This wasn't demonic. No warp entities manifested. There were no ritual circles or signs of chaos possession. Instead, the phenomena resembled what scholars of the Dark Age of technology once described as spiritual coherence, a synchronizing of human minds beyond warp space. A collective psychic dreaming. The spiral sun, it seemed, had become more than symbol. It was an idea that radiated, an ideology capable of echoing through the warp without corruption. That terrified the Imperium more than any daemon ever could. And so, the black ships turned to more desperate measures. Culling squads were dispatched into the depths of Heliosa, not merely to capture, but to erase. Heliosa's youngest were the first targets, those who showed signs of precognition, of telepathy, of visionary dreaming. They vanished. In some cases, families vanished with them. One Hab section reported every child under 10 missing within an hour. The Vox recordings are chilling. Soft lullabies interrupted by screams, then silence. The cult responded with mourning, not war. Shrines were erected to the stolen breaths, filled with toys, fragments of clothing, and recitations of remembered names. It was a grief so massive that it altered the planet's psychic signature, so much so that a passing inquisitorial vessel reported an ocean of sorrow felt before even breaking atmosphere. This was not resistance, it was suffering sanctified. Among the most infamous cases was that of Luma, the blind prophet child whose visions had stirred rebellion. She was taken during the 6th wave of abductions. But unlike others, her disappearance sparked a cataclysm. On the day of her seizure, every sensor across Heliosa registered a psychic pulse that caused nightmares across 5 Hive cities. 10 Imperial agents were found dead, their minds fused into their helmets. In their place, scrawled in ash, was a single phrase, "We do not forget." The black ships, despite their authority, began to retreat. The deeper into Heliosa they pushed, the more resistance they encountered. Not physical, but emotional. Psykers began exhibiting strange immunity to null fields. Precognition became contagious. Entire neighborhoods anticipated raids before they occurred. In one haunting report, a telepathica commander detailed how a targeted child simply vanished from her crib before collection, leaving only the words, "already home," painted in light on the wall. The telepathica sought to control the mindscape, but Heliosa had rewritten its own subconscious. The spiral sun did not burn in the warp, it hummed, resonant and calm, defying classification. It was not a beacon of power but of unity, not a scream but a chorus. Eventually, the culls slowed, not because they were complete, but because they had failed. Heliosa's psychic bloom could not be uprooted. It was not centralized, it was diffuse, recursive, embedded in belief and shared identity. The black ships withdrew, leaving behind empty hives and broken minds. And still the spiral sun shone, not in defiance, but in mourning. Heliosa had paid in blood, yes, but it had become something else entirely. A world dreaming together, a belief made psychic flesh. The Emperor's children not crying for salvation, but whispering, "We are already whole." They called them steel choirs. marching columns of converted labor servitors, hive enforcers, and flame-touched devotees, each singing the hymns of the breath as they stormed strongpoints still loyal to the Imperium. The uprising had passed from faith into fire. Heliosa, once shrouded in spiritual murmur, now roared with coordinated revolt. It was civil war, but nothing like the brutal efficiency of standard rebellions. It was messy, poetic, irrationally orchestrated, and terribly beautiful. The spires became battlegrounds of contradiction. Baroque manufactoria turned into war altars, where cogitator halls echoed with psalms instead of machine commands. Plasteel walkways bore the banners of the spiral sun, stitched from work rags and communion veils. The cult had not prepared for war in the traditional sense. There were no standing armies, no logistical networks, but there was devotion, and it was more dangerous than any strategic doctrine. They moved like dreams given flesh, erratic, imprecise, yet unstoppable. Hive Orotos fell first, not to bombardment, but to silence. Its Arbit's garrison, already psychologically shattered by prior hallucinations and the collapse of psychic order, found themselves facing entire populations kneeling in the streets, singing. No weapons raised, no barricades. The Arbites opened fire, and then stopped. One by one, they dropped their weapons, not out of rebellion, but in exhaustion. The last Arbite's marshal wept before placing her badge on a child's palm, whispering, "I only wanted to serve truth." She was later seen leading a chorus of hymn scribes, never taking up arms again. Elsewhere, the violence grew sharper. In Hive Selrix, loyalist PDF forces attempted to hold the central Prometheum spires. They succeeded briefly until a single captured shrine seraph, whose voice had already sparked 3 riots, was led to the Vox systems. She did not scream, she sang. One note, sustained, perfect. Within hours, half the defenders defected, not through fear or bribery, but through revelation. The spire was surrendered, not stormed. The defenders offered it like an offering to the breath. By now, Heliosa's skies had darkened. Ash storms, byproducts of collapsed infrastructures and burning sanctums, rolled like black seas overhead. In the glow of the infernos, warriors marched with tears in their eyes and sacred words etched into their armor. We burned to remember. Makeshift tanks, carved from mining crawlers and refitted transport hulks, bore names not of warlords but of saints. Saint Luma, Saint Orin, Saint Silence. They moved not to conquer, but to cleanse, to burn away the falsehoods of a dying world and plant in the ashes the seeds of truth. The loyalists did not fall quietly. Not all were swayed by vision and verse. House Dargalan's private forces, already blooded from early massacres, began deploying chemical agents in spiral-heavy zones. They called it pacification. Survivors called it murder. When one such strike leveled a mid-spire chapel, the spiral sun retaliated not with vengeance, but with remembrance. A chain of linked human bodies, volunteers who sat in place where the dead had worshipped, refusing to move or resist. They sang until the last voice faded. No soldier who witnessed the act fired a second shot. But the spiral sun was not a monolith. Among its ranks grew factions with diverging aims. Some believed in total planetary transformation. Others argued for containment, fearing outside intervention. Still others, called the Harrowed Flame, took on the most extreme view, that Terra itself must be reabsorbed into Heliosa's truth, that the Emperor's body must be reclaimed, not destroyed, but lifted into the breath anew. These extremists began targeting not loyalists, but moderate spiral leaders. Internal schisms flared, and for a time, the war turned inward. It was during this phase that the concept of burning thrones emerged. Every faction, moderate, militant, or mystic, began constructing throne shrines in the centers of reclaimed spires, not to seat leaders, but to burn them. It was a ritual of voluntary sacrifice. Cult figures, saints, and even war chaplains would anoint themselves in sacred oils and ascend these thrones to be immolated, becoming both symbol and beacon. These acts were neither mourned nor celebrated. They were recorded in silence, and the ashes preserved in reliquaries built into hive ventilation systems, so that every breath would carry their memory. In time, these burning rites became the new spine of the movement. They stabilized the fracturing factions, unifying them not through hierarchy but through sacrifice. The Heliosan war machine became a sacrament. Every weapon was inscribed with verses, every kill recorded in song. There were no medals, no promotions, only one rank, witness. To fight for the spiral sun was not to command, but to remember. The conflict reached its height during what came to be known as the Canticle Week, a span of 7 days during which every hive launched simultaneous offensives, not for territory, but for symbolism. Defaced statues of imperial saints were cleaned, not destroyed. Abandoned churches were repurposed as spiral chapels. Vox speakers blasted harmonies that caused seizures in those who resisted and rapture in those who believed. The line between faith and frequency blurred. Heliosa did not just fight, it sang, and the galaxy, listening in fragments and interference, could not help but feel the echo. It was not victory, not yet, but it was something worse for the Imperium. It was a new way of waging war, not for conquest, not even for survival, but for meaning, for breath, for a second Terra born not of command, but of communion. And in the Song of Falling Spires, you could almost believe that something sacred was taking root in the soot. They did not wear names, they wore silence. Operatives of the Officio Assassinorum arrived not in the wake of planetary declarations or war zone escalations, but when symbols grew louder than bullets. Heliosa, with its spiral sun and martyr saints, had reached that threshold. It was no longer a rebellion. It was a story. And the Imperium understood the power of stories better than most, so they sent the ones who kill meaning. The first target was the voice of Orin, a young woman named Ceres Maid, rumored to be the spiritual successor of Lady Varel Oran. She did not command troops or organize logistics. She simply stood each dawn atop the spire balconies and whispered to the wind. Her words reached ears she never saw. Her messages bent no vox wave, but entire squads reported shifting loyalties after hearing her phrases echo through Hive air. On the 81st day of the uprising, she was found kneeling in silent prayer, untouched. Her heart stopped. Autopsy revealed no wounds. But nearby, in soot-scratched words, was a phrase, "The last breath is not silence. It is seed." The Calidus operative who ended her existence likely wept. That was the rumor, at least, spread by surviving cult members who claimed to have seen a silhouette in the ash fall to its knees after the act. Whether this was truth or myth, the result was irreversible. Ceres became more powerful in death. Her final whisper, amplified by mourning, echoed in every shrine for weeks. The Officio had removed a person, but inadvertently forged a relic. Next came the Visage Cleanse campaign. Eversor and Vindicare agents were deployed not against leaders but icons. Murals were defaced, saints' bodies stolen from reliquaries, entire Vox archives corrupted with false memory. One saboteur rewired a sermon hall's picked feed system to project a single falsified image of Spiral faithful devouring their own dead. The footage aired once before being consumed by glitch fire. The hall was abandoned and then, eerily, cleaned. Not destroyed, preserved, as if the cult had made room for the lie within their truth. But it was the attempted erasure of Saint Luma that triggered the darkest hour. She was gone, taken by the black ships, her relics scattered. The Officio targeted every trace, her birthplace incinerated, her disciples exsanguinated, her hymns overwritten. But something resisted. A low hum began to infect auditory systems. Vox beacons malfunctioned, spouting lines from her last known sermon. You cannot unbreathe a breath already drawn. Even null-helmed operatives reported auditory hallucinations, children's laughter, faint lullabies. The Spiral Sun responded not with defense, but with absorption. They began collecting remnants of these failed assassinations, weapons that missed, robes torn by shrapnel, even bloodstains left behind. These were displayed as failures of silence. Witnesses would meditate beside them, not in anger, but in gratitude. The Officio, famed for its surgical finality, found itself entangled in something it could not cut. Narrative. Perhaps the most famous moment came with the Hunterfall event. A Vindicare agent, known only as Edge Black, was tasked with eliminating 3 simultaneous figures across different hive levels, each considered a key node in the cult's ideal spread. He succeeded in 2. The third, a nameless psalm writer known only as Gairn, turned to face his sniper's nest moments before the kill. No words, no weapons, just a raised hand. The bullet never fired. Black was later found dead in his perch, his rifle melted, eyes burned from the inside. The final frame from his scope was salvaged and became a central Spiral Sun icon, a man and a shadow, both kneeling. The Officio Assassinorum did not withdraw. They do not do that. But their missions became fewer, and their successes, when they occurred, seemed strangely hollow. Every kill turned into scripture. every corpse into prophecy. The cult had found a way to metabolize murder, to weave death into their tapestry of becoming. Even failure became faith. This posed an unprecedented dilemma. The officio's entire function is predicated on finality. Kill the seed before it sprouts, snuff the candle before it spreads light. But on Heliosa, light fed on shadow. Silence amplified song. Death was not the end, it was punctuation. Eventually, even the most hardened operatives began to question their mission. Not out loud, never out loud, but in their pattern deviations, in the hesitations seconds logged by monitoring cogitators, there were signs. One Culex's agent reportedly self-immolated within a spiral sanctum, causing no deaths, only a wave of psychic calm that put 1,000 hivers into peaceful sleep. And so the Officio Assassinorum continued to work, but the cult learned to use them. Each death became a signal, each loss a word. Heliosa had turned murder into meaning. And the Imperium, for all its power, had no weapon to counter that. They did not map it, they envisioned it. The astral delusion, as the Imperium would later label it, was not a territory or doctrine. It was a shared hallucination made ideological, a metaphysical world glimpsed through trance, agony, or sublime clarity. The seers of Heliosa, once scorned as mad, now preached with the certainty of cartographers. Not of land, but of meaning. They claimed that Heliosa was merely the echo, what they called the clay shell. The true Terra, the astral Terra, had been born within the collective soul of mankind, and now hovered, unseen, just beyond the veil of perception. It began with dreams. A wave of synchronized visions swept across the Hive cities. Spire-born nobles and sump-dwellers alike spoke of walking through gleaming ruins lit by twin suns, one black, one golden. The buildings were vast and crumbling, yet alive with whispers. The sky was both night and day, and always there stood a single throne at the center, built of breathing stone, atop which sat not the emperor, but a figure that shifted with each viewer. For some, it was their child. For others, their dead parent. A few wept as they described seeing only a mirror. These dreams crystallized into belief. The Spiral Sun cultists began constructing mental maps, not of real geography, but of spiritual resonance. They held that the astral Terra was real, not in space, but in essence. That the Emperor's soul had long fled the Golden Throne and found home in this place of unified suffering, hope, and memory. Heliosa, through its pain and defiance, had opened the path. "We are the gate," they chanted. "We are the pilgrimage." Astropaths who encountered these beliefs began exhibiting symptoms never before recorded. Not warp insanity, but profound calm. One astropath aboard the merchant vessel Gossamer Tooth drew, in precise detail, the architecture of a place he had never seen. A vast amphitheater of bone and crystal, identical to dozens of other sketches found across Heliosa's rebellion archives. When questioned, he whispered, "I only translated what they already knew." The Inquisition took him. His ship later returned, automated and empty. The belief spread further, taking root in those not even physically present. Traders, rogues, psychers, navigators, all reported sightings of a phantom world during warp transit. A drifting sphere of immense scale, always just outside navigational parameters. Some tried to chart it, none succeeded. The navigators who attempted direct approach emerged blind or raving, yet unable to express fear, only awe. "We touched the dream," one said, before clawing out his third eye. The cult began referring to it as the astral Terra, but the term delusion came later, a label applied by the Ordo Hereticus in an effort to discredit the concept. They knew the power of naming. If it was a delusion, it could be dismissed. But for Heliosa, naming it was baptism. The astral delusion became the core of a new theology. It was no longer enough to reform Heliosa. The goal now was ascension, not through technology or sorcery, but through spiritual synchronization. Entire blocks of hivers entered voluntary coma states, induced by prayer chant and neurochemical hymns. They called it pilgrimage. While their bodies atrophied, they claimed to walk the astral streets, to commune with saints unborn, to see the Emperor, not as ruler, but as guide. When they returned, if they returned, they spoke with unified voice, often repeating strange phrases that made no grammatical sense but invoked intense emotional response in listeners. "Sun breathes in the soil's shadow. We remember the echo before it sang." The Imperium could not allow it to continue. They sent psi inquisitors, fleets of sanctioned telepaths, even an experimental null-field bomb to detonate over Hive Felmar. It failed. The bomb neutralized all warp energies, but the visions intensified. One inquisitor collapsed during debriefing and begged to be buried alive, claiming he had touched the lungs of meaning. Even among the Spiral Sun, some grew fearful. A splinter sect known as the Clay Wardens rejected the astral delusion, believing it a trap woven by a greater consciousness, perhaps even a sleeping god. But the main body of the cult embraced it. To them, the astral Terra was the proof of their heresy's righteousness. The Emperor's soul had fled bureaucracy. He now waited not in a tomb of golden decay, but in a city of song and sacrifice. To find him, one need only dream true. It became the new sacrament, pilgrimage, synchronization, reflection. The Spiral Sun was no longer a rebellion. It was a choir tuning itself to hear the song of a god no longer trapped by flesh. And in the dark places of the Hive, people listened, not with ears, with memory, with longing, with breath. The astral delusion may never have existed. It may be a fabrication, a psychic resonance loop triggered by collective grief. But to the people of Heliosa, it was as real as ash and blood. A promised land born not from stars, but from the soul. A second Terra waiting not to be found, but to be remembered. They arrived in shadow, as they always do, cloaked in codes and silence, agents of the holy orders of the Inquisition. But Heliosa greeted them not with fear, nor with rage, but with something more unnerving: reverence. The Inquisitors expected to be hunted or hailed as executioners. Instead, they found sanctuaries prepared for them, rooms scented with ash and memory, food untouched and beds unslept in. The Spiral Sun had known they were coming, not through espionage, but belief. The delegation was fractured from the start. The Ordo Hereticus sent interrogator Saint Keelan Dine, a flame-eyed Puritan who believed Heliosa to be the seed of a second Horus heresy. Ordo Xenos dispatched cryptanalyst Athela Ray, who suspected the Spiral Sun to be a subtle form of alien infiltration, perhaps psychic parasitism. And most curiously, the Ordo Malleus assigned Inquisitor Varn Helor, a radical known for once allying with a daemon host to save an agri-world. They did not trust one another. But more importantly, they did not agree on what they were witnessing. Keelan Dine acted quickly, dispatching purge protocols and executing 6 suspected cult leaders in Hive Tress. The Spiral Sun did not resist. The executed were placed in sanctified shrines, their names sung into litanies. Their deaths were not seen as defeats, but as confirmations. "You burn us," a surviving witness told Dine, "and we shine brighter." Athela Ray uncovered coded transmissions buried in Heliosa's datasphere. These patterns resembled xenolexicon structures, recursive and fractalized, far beyond standard linguistic models. She presented her findings to the delegation with concern, warning of an unknown intelligence influencing the spiral doctrine. But her data was dismissed as inconclusive. Worse, the very patterns she decrypted began appearing in her dreams, written across the walls in fireless flame. Varn Hilor wandered. He did not command. He listened. He walked among the breath chambers and shrine vaults, spoke to children who had dreamed of a golden field, where every footstep became music. He interviewed defected Arbites who could recite the Spiral Creed without ever having learned it. And slowly, Helor began to change. He no longer reported to Terra. He started writing his own gospel, the Codex of the Unbound Breath. To his peers, he had become compromised. To Heliosa, he had been reborn. The schism came to a head when Keelan Dine ordered the detonation of an ancient transmission tower, believing it to be the primary conduit of spiral psychic propagation. Athela Ray objected, arguing that the structure was inert. Varn Hilor outright defied the order. The standoff lasted 3 days. In that time, the Spiral Sun constructed a listening garden around the tower. Thousands of believers simply sat in silence, ringed around the base, meditating, breathing in unison. When the explosives were finally activated, the detonation killed over 10,000. But the tower did not fall. Its inner mechanisms, untouched for millennia, began to hum. A single phrase pulsed through every vox on the planet: "We are still listening." Keelan Dine withdrew in shame. His final report marked Heliosa as an existential blasphemy. He was later found dead on his return voyage, his body folded inwards, mouth filled with ash. Athela Ray never left. She joined a spiral sect known as the Reflectors, who believed the Emperor did not dwell above but within, accessible through introspection, not supplication. She wrote a treatise titled Xeno as Mirror, arguing that the spiral sun's recursive language might be humanity speaking to itself across dimensional boundaries. Varn Helor declared Heliosa a proto-faith state, a new model of human spiritual evolution. He proposed the formation of a separate Ordo Pneuma, dedicated to monitoring and guiding psychic belief as a force of galactic significance. His petition was, unsurprisingly, rejected. He was declared excommunicate traitorous. But Helor did not resist. He burned his rosette publicly and sat cross-legged in the ash beside the St. Luma reliquary, reciting a litany of dreams. The inquisitorial divide was complete. Heliosa had broken not through strength or sorcery, but by proving that the Imperium's own seekers of truth could be seduced, not by lies, but by clarity. The spiral sun had no demons, no traitors, no monsters. It only had believers. And in them, the Inquisition found not corruption but the terrifying possibility that the Emperor's plan had changed. Across the galaxy, scattered inquisitors began to debate Heliosa not as a threat but as a prophecy. Some called it a cancer, others a chrysalis. In sealed chambers beneath star fortresses and in forgotten void monasteries, whispers began to take shape. What if Terra was never meant to be the end? What if Heliosa was the beginning? They never called it a fall. Not truly. To the Imperium, Heliosa's collapse was a grim inevitability. To the spiral sun, it was transfiguration. In a final act of coordinated devastation, Imperial fleets broke through the outer orbital defenses, launching saturation bombardments across major Hive sectors. Hive Celrix was reduced to slag. Hive Trez, already a shrine to martyrdom, burned again, this time from the sky. The air turned to poison. The seas boiled. Entire populations were glassed without warning. It was not war, it was surgical apocalypse. But even as the spires fell, they sang. The survivors did not scream, they recited. Spirals of ash formed naturally across the wreckage, shaped by the airflow of incinerated sanctums. Servitors left to die in collapsed transport systems were found humming Heliosan harmonies long after their minds had failed. Vox transmissions became uninterruptible loops of final prayers, spoken not in despair but in declaration. We are not ended. We are echoed. The spiral sun's final bastion was the Cathedral of the Breath Unseen, a massive structure built from repurposed Hive components, coated in layers of sacred script and martyr blood. As Imperial storm units breached its gates, they found not soldiers but families, gathered as if for a last meal. They did not run. They did not fight. They simply stared, each eye reflecting a serenity the attackers could not explain. One commissar reportedly removed his bolt pistol and set it at his own feet before kneeling among them. He died hours later, arms around a crying child who asked, "Are we dreams?" The Imperium claimed victory. Official records listed Heliosa as pacified. The word was chosen carefully, not destroyed, not redeemed. Pacified, silenced. But what followed was stranger than silence. The psychic signature of the planet did not fade. If anything, it intensified. Warp navigators passing nearby reported harmonic interference unlike anything they'd encountered. Gentle, persistent, sorrowful. Like a planet weeping in song. Attempts to repopulate the world failed. Colonist ships experienced mass suicides before landing. One regiment of penal legionnaires went mad, carving spiral symbols into the walls of their landing craft with fingernails and teeth. Eventually, the Imperium declared the world interdicted. No longer Heliosa. No longer a Hive world. Merely a designation, T-Sis. But the spiral sun did not die there. Fragments of its faith scattered. Into the void, into vox chains, into minds cracked open by trauma and grief. Cults began appearing in far-flung places, Ministorum vault cities, Mechanicus spires, Agri worlds. They bore no name. They asked for no conversions. But their members shared dreams, songs, moments of stillness where breath was taken as prayer. The Adeptus Terra tried to trace the origin of these whispers. Each time they did, they found no leadership, no coordination, only symbols scrawled in places of suffering. Spiral suns painted in blood, children who knew songs they were never taught. Inquisitors burned entire towns, but the ideas remained. To the survivors of Heliosa, those few who escaped or were exiled, the story was never about winning. It was about witnessing. They carried memory like a virus, soft, invisible, irrepressible. One such refugee, decades later, would be found on a border world, painting murals of a world made of light and ash where every breath sang. When interrogated, he wept, not in fear but in reverence. "We rose," he said, not above, within. Even in its supposed death, Heliosa refused to vanish. It had become a ghost, a song, a theological scar carved into the heart of the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy banned mention of it. The Inquisition swore to eradicate its remnants. But every suppression birthed more myth. And in quiet places, priests and paupers alike would sometimes close their eyes and imagine spires not of stone, but of memory. Not raised in defiance, but in becoming. The fall of Heliosa was not the end of a world. It was the birth of a question. What if the Emperor never wanted obedience, but awakening? And though that question remains heresy, it also remains unanswered. They say the warp remembers. Not in the way we do, not with chronology or clarity, but with emotion. With impressions scorched into its tides like echoes of ancient screams or hymns never finished. And in those endless seas of agony and madness, something of Heliosa remains. Not as a beacon, not as a daemon world, but as a scar. A silence so deep it sings. Heliosa declared itself a second Terra. For that alone it should have been erased, and by all accounts it was. Its hives crushed, its saints immolated, its believers scattered. And yet it endures, not in stone, but in souls. There are places in the galaxy where its memory flickers like a hidden breath. A vox transmission on a death world where miners sing to themselves in harmonic phrases no one taught them. A lone scribe in the administratum who finds himself doodling spirals between columns of figures. A new saint, beatified by the ecclesiarchy, who whispers phrases that were once banned. Breath is sacrament. To many in the Imperium, Heliosa is a ghost best forgotten, an abomination of belief, a contagion of hope. But the truth is, Heliosa was never truly about rebellion. It was about memory. It was about the idea that Terra, in all its gilded decay, might not be the final word in humanity's faith. That perhaps the Emperor did not seek worship, but understanding. Not thrones, but breath. The spiral sun has become a whispering current in the religious subconscious of the Imperium. Some inquisitors now believe it was the first true post-Terran heresy, not anti-imperial but extra-imperial. Others claim it was the soul of humanity trying to breathe outside the choking constraints of history. Whatever it was, it changed everything. Even those who never speak its name carry it like smoke on their skin. In the depths of some forgotten librarium, a lone scholar might find fragments, scraps of burned parchment, corrupted vox recordings, faded wall etchings of a world that sang its own sanctity. The ecclesiarchy forbids it. The Ordo Hereticus still purges for it. But the Emperor, wherever he may dwell, on Terra, in the warp, in the dreaming souls of those who dare to hope, he does not speak. And that silence is where Heliosa lives on. So we ask not as believers, but as witnesses. What does it mean when a world defies the stars not with blades or bolters, but with vision? What truth lies in rebellion made sacred, in heresy woven from harmony? Perhaps the answer is in the breath itself. In the final exhalation of a hive world that dared to imagine itself holy. And if you're still listening, if you've heard even a whisper of Heliosa in your dreams, in a hymn that didn't make sense, in a moment where your breath caught for no reason, you are not alone. Like, subscribe and stand witness. The stars remember, and so do we.